"We're ashamed of you," my daughter-in-law said at Christmas dinner, and for a moment, the entire room went silent except for the soft crackling of the fire beside the dining table. I remember the exact way her wine glass caught the light when she lifted it slightly after saying those words, as if humiliating me in front of the whole family was some kind of holiday joke. A few people laughed nervously. Someone coughed into their napkin. My son Daniel kept staring down at his plate of turkey, and stuffing like the mashed potatoes suddenly required his full attention. That hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. The Whitmore family Christmas dinner had always been my favorite night of the year. For 37 years, I hosted it in the old colonial house my husband Thomas and I bought outside Hartford when Daniel was still a little boy obsessed with toy trains and hot cocoa. Even after Thomas passed away 3 winters ago, I kept the traditions alive. I still hung the same red stockings over the fireplace. I still baked pecan pies from scratch. I still wrapped gifts with silver ribbon because Thomas once told me silver made everything feel elegant. But this year, Vanessa insisted on hosting Christmas dinner at their new house instead. She said it would be easier for everyone. I should have understood what that really meant. Their dining room looked like something out of a furniture catalog. Everything was white marble, gold candles, and expensive decorations that didn't feel lived in. The tree stood at least 9 feet tall beside the staircase, covered in ornaments that matched perfectly, but somehow had no warmth to them at all. I arrived carrying my homemade pie in both hands while snow fell softly across the driveway. Vanessa opened the door, looked me up and down slowly, then smiled the kind of smile women use when they want to insult you politely. "Margaret," she said, air-kissing near my cheek. "You actually wore that sweater?" I glanced down at the cream-colored cardigan Thomas had bought me years ago at a Christmas market in Vermont. "It's warm," I answered softly. Vanessa laughed under her breath and stepped aside so I could enter. The evening only got worse from there. Every little comment felt carefully designed to make me feel unwanted. Vanessa complained that my pie had too much sugar. She joked that older people shouldn't drive after dark. At one point, she even moved me away from the center of the family photo and placed me near the edge beside the coat rack. Daniel noticed. I know he did, but he said nothing. That silence settled into my chest heavier than the winter air outside. Then came the toast. Vanessa stood at the head of the table holding her wine glass, while everyone looked toward her. "I just want to say how grateful I am for family," she began sweetly. "Especially family members who know how to grow and adapt instead of making everything harder for everyone else." I saw her eyes slide toward me. A few uncomfortable glances passed around the table. My granddaughter Lily looked nervous beside her father. Vanessa smiled wider. "Because honestly," she continued, "we're ashamed of you sometimes, Margaret." Someone let out a shocked little laugh. My fork froze halfway to my plate. "Vanessa," Lily whispered quietly, but Vanessa ignored her completely. "The way you cling to the past," she said. "The constant guilt trips. The old-fashioned behavior. It's exhausting." I slowly placed my fork down beside my plate so carefully that my hands wouldn't shake. Daniel still wouldn't look at me. Not even then. I stared at the candles flickering in the middle of the table and suddenly understood something terrifying. I wasn't sitting with my family anymore. I was sitting with people who had already decided I no longer belonged among them. I stayed at the table for another 30 seconds after Vanessa finished speaking, maybe longer. Long enough for the silence to become unbearable for everyone except her. She looked perfectly comfortable sitting there with her wine glass in hand, almost proud of herself. Across the table, Lily kept staring at me with wide, anxious eyes, while slowly twisting her napkin in her lap. The poor girl looked like she wanted to disappear. Daniel finally cleared his throat and forced out a weak laugh. "Vanessa does not mean it like that, Mom." But she did. We all knew she did. I looked at my son then, really looked at him, and for a moment I barely recognized the man sitting there. His hair was grayer around the temples now. His shoulders carried the weight of middle age and expensive responsibilities. But his eyes looked tired in a different way. Avoidant. Smaller somehow. The same boy who used to run downstairs every Christmas morning in flannel pajamas now could not even defend his own mother at the dinner table. "It is all right," I said quietly. "I should probably head home anyway. Roads are getting icy." Vanessa leaned back in her chair. "Probably for the best," she replied before taking another sip of wine. Not one person corrected her. Not one. I stood slowly and reached for my coat, hanging near the staircase. The house smelled like cinnamon candles and rosemary ham, but underneath it all there was another smell now. Something cold. Something rotten hiding beneath polished floors and expensive decorations. Lily hurried after me while the others remained seated. "Grandma, wait," she whispered once we reached the front hallway. Her cheeks were red and embarrassed. "I am really sorry." I touched her face gently. "You do not need to apologize for grown people making ugly choices, sweetheart." She looked like she wanted to say something else, but footsteps echoed behind us before she could. Vanessa appeared holding my pie container with one manicured hand. "You forgot this," she said. Her voice was sweet again, now that nobody else was close enough to hear the cruelty underneath it. I reached for the container carefully. "Thank you." Vanessa smiled tightly. "You know, Margaret, people would probably feel more comfortable around you if you stopped acting like the victim all the time." I stared at her for several seconds without answering. Snow drifted softly outside the glass doorway behind me. The Christmas lights lining the driveway reflected against the polished floor like tiny broken stars. "Good night, Vanessa," I said calmly. Something about my tone seemed to irritate her more than anger would have. Her smile disappeared immediately. I walked out into the cold before she could speak again. The snow had already covered most of the driveway in a thin white layer. My old Buick started on the second try, while soft jazz Christmas music played low through the speakers. I gripped the steering wheel and sat there for a minute watching the glowing windows of Daniel's house. From outside, it looked beautiful, warm, perfect, like the kind of family home people admire in holiday movies. But appearances can hide a great many things. The drive back to my house took almost 40 minutes because of the weather. Empty streets stretched through quiet neighborhoods glowing with Christmas lights and inflatable snowmen. Every house looked full of laughter except mine. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands felt stiff from the cold, and from holding back emotions I refused to let spill over. My little colonial house sat dark and silent beneath the falling snow. Thomas used to leave the porch light on for me whenever I went somewhere at night. Even after 37 years of marriage, he always waited awake until I got home safely. I still found myself expecting to see his shadow through the front curtains sometimes. Old habits survive long after people are gone. Inside, the house smelled faintly like pine and coffee. I hung my coat carefully by the door and set the untouched pie container on the kitchen counter. The silence pressed against me immediately. No voices, no laughter, no family. Just the ticking clock above the stove and the distant hum of the heater fighting against the December cold. I slowly walked into the living room and sat beside the Christmas tree Thomas and I used to decorate together every year. Most of the ornaments were old now. Handmade angels Daniel made in elementary school. Tiny wooden sleds from Vermont vacations. A faded silver bell Thomas bought during our honeymoon in Boston nearly 40 years ago. I reached toward the bell and held it gently between my fingers. "You were right about her," I whispered into the empty room. Because deep down, Thomas had known something was wrong long before I did. He never trusted Vanessa's kindness. He once told me that some people smile only with their mouths, never with their eyes. At the time, I thought he was being unfair. Tonight, sitting alone beside the tree while snow covered the windows outside, I realized my husband had seen the truth years before the rest of us. The next morning, I woke before sunrise even though I had barely slept at all. The house felt colder than usual, and for several minutes I remained in bed staring at the pale gray light creeping through the curtains. Christmas morning used to sound different in this house. There used to be footsteps racing down the hallway, wrapping paper tearing open, Thomas laughing while Daniel shook presents under the tree pretending to guess what was inside. Back then, the holidays felt safe, predictable, full of warmth that had nothing to do with money or appearances. Now all I could hear was the heater clicking on and off somewhere downstairs. I finally pulled myself out of bed and wrapped my robe tightly around my shoulders before walking into the kitchen. Snow had piled higher overnight, covering the backyard in smooth, untouched white. I filled the kettle and stood quietly beside the sink while coffee brewed. My hands still felt unsteady every time I remembered Vanessa's face across that dinner table. Not angry, not emotional, amused. That was the part one could not stop thinking about. She had enjoyed humiliating me. There was something deeply unsettling about realizing another person takes pleasure in making you feel small. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat near the tree again. The silver bell ornament still hung low on the right side, exactly where Thomas always placed it. He used to say every Christmas tree needed one imperfect ornament close enough to touch, because perfection made a home feel lonely. I smiled faintly at the memory before the smile disappeared just as quickly. My phone buzzed against the side table beside me. For one foolish second, I thought it might be Daniel calling to apologize. It was only a promotional text from the grocery store. I set the phone back down without answering. Around 10 o'clock, I forced myself to begin cleaning up the wrapping paper and dishes I had left untouched the night before. Keeping busy always helped me think. That was something else Thomas taught me. Fold laundry when your heart hurts. Wash dishes when your mind races. Small tasks keep grief from swallowing you whole. I was wiping down the kitchen counters when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. My heart jumped hard enough to make me pause. Through the frosted glass beside the front door, I saw a familiar silhouette standing on the porch bundled in a long winter coat. Lily. I opened the door quickly. Sweetheart, what are you doing here? Snowflakes clung to her dark blonde hair and scarf while she stepped inside, holding a small paper bag against her chest. Her eyes looked red like she had been crying. Dad thinks I am at Ashley's house, she admitted quietly. I needed to see you. I closed the door behind her while cold air swirled briefly through the hallway. Come inside before you freeze. Lily followed me into the kitchen where I poured her a mug of hot chocolate the way she liked it, with extra marshmallows melting across the top. She sat at the table silently for several moments, twisting the sleeve of her sweater between nervous fingers. Grandma, she finally whispered. I did not know she was going to say those things last night. I swear. I know, sweetheart. She shook her head quickly. No, you do not understand. Mama's been talking about you like that for months now. Maybe longer. Something cold settled deep in my stomach. Lily stared down into her cup while speaking softly. She tells Dad that you embarrass them. She says you make them look old-fashioned. She says people at the country club feel uncomfortable around you because you are too emotional and too attached to the past. I leaned slowly against the kitchen counter, gripping the edge harder than I meant to. Your father lets her talk that way? Lily looked miserable. At first he defended you, but lately he just stays quiet. Quiet. That word again. Silence can destroy families just as surely as cruelty can. Lily reached into the paper bag she brought and carefully pulled out several folded documents. I found these in Mom's office last week, she said nervously. I think you need to see them. I frowned and took the papers from her hands. At first glance, they looked like financial statements and property evaluations. Then I saw the address typed clearly across the top of one page. My house. Another document listed the estimated market value of the lake cabin Thomas built 20 years ago in New Hampshire. My chest tightened immediately. Why does Vanessa have these? I asked quietly. Lily swallowed hard. Because she has been trying to convince Dad to sell everything. The room suddenly felt much smaller around me. Everything. Lily nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes again. She said once you move into assisted living, there will be no reason for you to keep any of it anymore. I sat down very slowly at the kitchen table while the papers trembled lightly in my hands. Across from me, Lily looked terrified, like a child who had accidentally shattered something precious and did not know how to fix it. Outside the window, snow continued falling softly across the backyard, covering everything in quiet white layers while inside my chest something far colder began settling into place. She wants me in assisted living? I finally asked. My own voice barely sounded familiar. Lily nodded reluctantly. Mom says the house is too much for you now. She keeps telling Dad it would be safer if you moved somewhere smaller. Safer. Funny how cruel people always wrap ugly intentions in gentle words. I lowered my eyes back to the documents spread across the table. There were handwritten notes in Vanessa's sharp, elegant handwriting besides several numbers. Renovation possibilities. Estimated resale value. Suggested timeline after property transfer. Transfer. Not inheritance. Not someday in the future. Soon. The realization made my stomach tighten painfully. Vanessa was not waiting for me to die. She was already planning my removal from the life I had built with Thomas long before I was gone. Lily wiped quickly at her eyes. Grandma, I did not know what to do. I heard Mom and Dad arguing last week after you left early from dinner. Arguing about what? She hesitated. Dad said it was too soon after Grandpa died to make changes with the properties. Mom got really angry. She said you were emotionally manipulating him by staying in the house. I let out a quiet breath. That felt strangely calm despite everything. Emotionally manipulating him. I thought about all the years I spent trying not to burden my son. I never asked Daniel for money. Never demanded holidays. Never complained when weeks passed without a phone call. I spent birthdays alone without mentioning it. I smiled through forgotten invitations and canceled plans because I told myself families go through phases. People get busy. But now I understood something painful. My silence had not protected our relationship. It had only made it easier for Vanessa to slowly erase me from it. Lily stared nervously toward the hallway before lowering her voice even further. There is something else. I looked at her carefully. What is it? Mom said Grandpa changed some legal paperwork before he died. She has been trying to find copies ever since. My heart skipped once. Thomas. Instantly, I remembered a rainy afternoon nearly a year before his death. We had been sitting together on the screened porch wrapped in blankets while thunder rolled across the yard. Thomas had looked unusually serious that day. Promise me something, Maggie, he said quietly while stirring cream into his coffee. If anything ever feels wrong after I am gone, talk to Harold Bennett immediately. Harold had been Thomas's attorney and closest friend since college. At the time I laughed softly and told him he sounded dramatic. Thomas only shook his head. I mean it. I never asked why. Back then, I still believed love and loyalty were permanent things. Now, sitting at my kitchen table with property evaluations spread in front of me like a map toward my own removal, I realized Thomas had seen warning signs long before I did. Grandma. Lily's voice pulled me back to the present. Are you all right? I folded the papers carefully into a neat stack before answering. I think your grandfather knew more than he ever told me. The room fell quiet again except for the ticking clock above the stove. Finally, Lily reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers felt cold from the weather outside. I do not want them to hurt you, she whispered. Hurt. The strange thing was, the humiliation from Christmas dinner already felt smaller now compared to this deeper betrayal unfolding underneath it. Vanessa did not simply dislike me. She wanted my place in the family erased entirely. The house, the lake cabin, the traditions, even the memories. Everything Thomas and I spent decades building had become assets to her. Numbers on paper. Opportunities. I stood slowly and carried the documents into the living room where the Christmas tree lights still glowed softly in the corner. Beneath the tree sat an old cedar chest Thomas used for important papers and photo albums. I had not opened it in months. Kneeling beside it, I lifted the heavy lid carefully while the familiar scent of cedar wood and old paper drifted upward. Inside were photo albums, military keepsakes, insurance folders, and bundles of Christmas cards tied with ribbon. Then, near the bottom beneath several files, I noticed a cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in Thomas's handwriting. Margaret. My hands froze instantly. The envelope looked untouched. Sealed. Waiting. I stared at the envelope for several long seconds before touching it. Something about seeing Thomas's handwriting again made my chest ache in a way I was not prepared for. He had always written my name carefully, every letter neat and deliberate, like he believed even small things deserved attention. Behind me, Lily stood quietly near the Christmas tree, watching without speaking. The soft colored lights reflected against the windows while snow continued drifting down outside, wrapping the whole neighborhood in silence. My fingers trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter along with several legal documents clipped neatly together. I recognized Harold Bennett's law office logo immediately at the top page. My heartbeat quickened. Carefully, I unfolded Thomas's letter first. Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has already gone wrong. I closed my eyes for a moment after reading that first sentence. Even now, even gone, Thomas somehow still knew exactly how to speak to me. His voice filled my mind, so clearly I could almost hear him sitting beside me in his old recliner. I continued reading slowly, while Lily remained silent nearby. There are things I chose not to burden you with while I was alive. I hoped I was wrong about them. Truly. But if certain people ever make you feel unwanted in your own family, I need you to remember something very important. You are not powerless, Maggie. Never let guilt convince you otherwise. Tears blurred my vision briefly, but I forced myself to continue. Several years ago, I made legal arrangements through Harold to protect you and everything we built together. If the time ever comes when someone attempts to pressure, manipulate, or remove you from your home or your place in this family. Contact Harold immediately before making any decisions. Trust him. I folded the letter carefully in my lap while my mind struggled to catch up with what I was reading. Beside me, Lily whispered softly, "Grandpa knew." I think he suspected more than he ever admitted. I picked up the attached documents next. Most of the language was legal and complicated, but several phrases stood out immediately. Irrevocable family trust. Primary beneficiary. Protective clause activation. I frowned while turning another page. Then I saw Vanessa's name listed beneath a paragraph discussing inheritance restrictions tied to hostile conduct against the surviving spouse. My breath caught sharply in my throat. "Oh my God," Lily whispered after reading over my shoulder. I kept scanning the pages slowly, barely able to believe what I was seeing. Years ago, Thomas had transferred the lake cabin, several investment accounts, and portions of our estate into a protected trust controlled entirely by conditions he designed himself. One condition appeared again and again throughout the paperwork. Any immediate family member found intentionally isolating, humiliating, coercing, or manipulating Margaret Whitmore could lose access to portions of the inheritance entirely at the trustee's discretion. Harold Bennett served as trustee. The room suddenly felt very still. Vanessa had spent months planning my removal from the family, while never realizing Thomas quietly built protections around me long before he died. I remembered all those evenings when Thomas sat alone in his study reviewing papers after dinner. I used to tease him about never fully retiring. He would only smile and tell me he was putting things in order. I thought he meant taxes, insurance, normal responsibilities older couples worry about. I never imagined he was preparing for something like this. Lily slowly lowered herself onto the couch beside me. "Mom has no idea about any of this," she said quietly. "Neither does Dad." I looked back down at the documents in my hands. For the first time since Christmas dinner, the helplessness inside me began shifting into something else. Not anger exactly. Clarity. Thomas had seen the slow changes happening in our family before I did. The dismissive comments. The manipulations hidden behind concern. The subtle attempts to push me aside while pretending it was for my own good. And instead of confronting everyone dramatically, he prepared quietly, carefully, like a man building shelter before a storm arrives. My eyes moved toward the final page clipped beneath the others. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Harold Bennett dated nearly 8 months before Thomas died. "Margaret, if circumstances ever require you to activate these protections, please contact me directly before discussing this matter with anyone else." Thomas was very specific about that. I leaned back slowly against the couch cushions while the tree lights flickered softly nearby. Across the room, our family photographs still lined the fireplace mantel. Vacations, graduations, Christmas mornings, smiling faces frozen in happier years. But now when I looked at them, I noticed something unsettling. Vanessa always stood slightly closer to Daniel than everyone else. Her hand always rested possessively on his arm. And little by little over the years, I seemed to move farther toward the edges of every picture without ever realizing it. Lily touched my arm gently. "What are you going to do?" I stared down at Thomas's letter one more time before answering quietly. "Exactly what your grandfather asked me to do." The day after Christmas, I drove into downtown Hartford just before noon with Thomas's letter folded carefully inside my purse beside the trust documents. The roads were still lined with dirty snow from the storm, and leftover Christmas decorations blinked weakly in storefront windows as if the city itself already seemed exhausted from pretending to celebrate. I parked outside Harold Bennett's office building and sat in the car for a moment staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked older than it had a week ago. Not weaker, just different. There is a kind of sadness that changes the shape of a person quietly, without anyone noticing until one day they look in the mirror and realize innocence has disappeared from their eyes. I finally stepped out into the cold and crossed the sidewalk slowly. Harold's office occupied the 3rd floor of an old brick building near the courthouse. Thomas used to joke that Harold refused to modernize because he thought computers were part of society's moral decline. The elevator creaked loudly all the way up. When I entered the reception area, the familiar smell of old paper, coffee, and polished wood hit me immediately. Some things really do remain unchanged no matter how much life falls apart around them. The receptionist smiled kindly when she recognized me. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Bennett is in a meeting, but he told us to bring you back immediately if you ever came by. Something about those words tightened my chest again. Harold already knew, or at least Thomas had prepared him to know someday. A few minutes later, Harold appeared in the hallway wearing the same dark suspenders and wire-rimmed glasses he had worn for as long as I could remember. His expression softened the second he saw me. "Margaret." He stepped forward and gently held both my hands. "I was wondering when I might see you." I tried to smile politely, but emotion caught unexpectedly in my throat. Harold must have noticed because his face grew more serious immediately. "Come into my office." His office looked exactly the same as it did 20 years ago. Heavy bookshelves lined the walls. Framed black and white photographs of Yale and Old Hartford covered one corner beside a brass desk lamp Thomas once gave him as a retirement gift. Harold closed the door quietly behind us before motioning for me to sit. I handed him the envelope and documents without speaking. He read through everything slowly while the room remained silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere behind his desk. Finally, he removed his glasses and leaned back heavily in his chair. I was afraid this day would come. Thomas really believed they would try to push me out? I asked quietly. Harold folded his hands together carefully before answering. Not at first, but during the last year of his life, he became increasingly concerned about Vanessa's influence over Daniel. Hearing someone else finally say it aloud sent a strange chill through me. Influence. That was exactly the right word for it. Not love. Not partnership. Control wrapped carefully inside charm and social polish. Harold sighed deeply. "Thomas noticed patterns you did not see because you always wanted peace in the family." Vanessa isolated Daniel slowly. First emotionally, then financially, then socially. I stared down at my hands in silence. "The trust clauses?" I finally asked. "Are they real?" Harold gave a small, humorless smile. "Very real." He opened another folder from his desk drawer and slid several copies toward me. "Your husband transferred significant portions of the estate into protected structures years ago. The lake cabin, the investment portfolio, even portions of the Hartford property holdings." My eyes widened slightly. Thomas never handled money carelessly, but I had never realized the full extent of what he quietly managed behind the scenes. Harold continued carefully. "More importantly, Thomas added behavioral protection clauses specifically tied to your treatment within the family." "Meaning?" Harold's expression hardened slightly for the first time since I arrived. "Meaning any direct attempt to isolate, pressure, humiliate, manipulate, or remove you from family assets or residences could trigger inheritance restrictions." I felt suddenly cold despite the warm office. "Vanessa has already been doing exactly that." "I know." My eyes lifted sharply toward him. Harold nodded slowly. "Thomas asked me to monitor certain developments after his death. I have heard enough over the past 2 years to become very concerned." "You knew?" "Not everything," he admitted quietly, "but enough." The silence between us stretched heavily. Finally, Harold leaned forward across the desk. "Margaret, I need you to understand something clearly. You are not dependent on Daniel or Vanessa for anything. Legally speaking, you hold far more power in this situation than they realize." Power. I almost laughed hearing that word connected to me. For months, I had felt like an unwanted guest slowly being removed from my own family. But now another realization began forming slowly beneath the grief and humiliation. Vanessa believed she was dealing with a lonely widow nobody would defend. She had no idea Thomas had already prepared for her years ago. For the next 3 days, I said nothing to Daniel or Vanessa. Not because I was afraid, but because for the first time in a very long while, I understood the value of silence. Silence reveals people. Once they believe you are weak, they stop hiding who they really are. I spent those days quietly moving through my routines while snow continued falling across Hartford in slow gray waves. I watered the plants near the kitchen window, folded laundry, read beside the fireplace in the evenings with Thomas's old wool blanket across my lap. Outwardly, everything looked normal. Inside, however, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer trying to save peace inside the family. I was finally seeing the family clearly. On Friday afternoon, Daniel called for the first time since Christmas dinner. His voice sounded overly cheerful in the careful, artificial way people speak when they know guilt is sitting quietly between every word. "Hey, Mom." I held the phone against my ear while standing at the sink rinsing a coffee mug. "Hello, Daniel. I just wanted to check in." A pause followed. "You doing all right?" I almost smiled at the question. Not because it was kind, but because it was late. I am fine. Another pause. I could hear muffled movement in the background, probably Vanessa unloading groceries or moving around their kitchen. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. Listen, about Christmas. Vanessa was stressed. You know how the holidays get. There it was. Not an apology. An explanation. I see. She did not mean things the way they sounded. I dried the mug slowly with a dish towel before answering. Then perhaps she should choose her words more carefully. Silence stretched across the line for several uncomfortable seconds. Daniel finally sighed. Mom, can we not make this into something bigger? Bigger. As if humiliation in front of family was some tiny misunderstanding I stubbornly refused to forget. I looked out the kitchen window toward the backyard where snow covered the garden Thomas built for me years ago. I am not making anything bigger, Daniel. I simply heard what your wife said. His tone tightened slightly. Vanessa feels like you judge her constantly. I closed my eyes briefly. Amazing how quickly the guilty transform themselves into victims. Does she? You always compare things to how Dad used to do them. You make comments about family traditions and holidays, and he hesitated carefully. Sometimes Vanessa feels like she can never measure up in your eyes. There it was again. Rewritten history. I spent years swallowing disappointment quietly so nobody would feel uncomfortable, and somehow even my silence had become an offense. Daniel, I said softly, did you call to ask how I was doing, or did you call to defend your wife? He said nothing. That silence answered everything for me. Finally, he cleared his throat awkwardly. We are having a small New Year's dinner next weekend. Vanessa thought maybe it would help if we all moved past this. I leaned lightly against the counter while considering his words. Harold had advised me not to confront anyone emotionally. Let them continue believing I knew nothing. Let them keep talking. Keep moving. Keep exposing themselves. That sounds lovely, I answered calmly. Daniel sounded almost relieved immediately. Good. Great. Lily will be happy to hear that. Of course she would. Lily still believed families could heal if people simply sat down together honestly. She had not yet learned how dangerous dishonest people become once they feel entitled to your forgiveness. After we hung up, I stood quietly in the kitchen for several minutes staring at the snow outside while the clock ticked softly above the stove. Then I walked into the living room and picked up the cordless phone again. Harold answered on the second ring. Margaret, they invited me to New Year's dinner. I heard papers shifting on his desk. Interesting. Daniel sounded nervous. Harold gave a low, thoughtful hum. Good. Nervous people make mistakes. I sat slowly in Thomas's recliner while speaking. What happens if Vanessa continues? Harold's voice became very measured. Legally, the trust can be reviewed immediately. Inheritance distributions can be frozen or redirected depending on the severity of the conduct. Frozen. Redirected. Vanessa spent years behaving like the future owner of everything Thomas built. She had no idea how fragile that future actually was. Do you think Daniel knows any of this? I asked quietly. No, Harold answered immediately. Thomas specifically instructed that nobody be informed unless necessary. I stared across the room at the framed family photo above the fireplace. It was taken 7 years ago at the lake cabin in New Hampshire. Daniel looked younger then. Softer. Lily sat between Thomas and me smiling with missing front teeth, while Vanessa stood beside Daniel wearing an expensive white sweater and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Back then, I thought she simply seemed reserved. Funny how clearly truth appears once illusion finally breaks apart. Margaret, Harold said gently, pulling me back to the present. You understand this is no longer simply about hurt feelings. I looked toward Thomas's empty chair across from mine. I know. This is about people attempting to erase your place in your own life. I let those words settle quietly into the silence around me because deep down, I realized they were true. Vanessa did not want compromise. She wanted removal. But for the first time since Christmas dinner, I no longer felt afraid of that truth. I only wondered how she would react once she realized Thomas had anticipated every move she planned to make. New Year's Eve arrived wrapped in freezing rain and gray skies that turned the whole city silver by late afternoon. I stood in my bedroom, carefully fastening the pearl earrings Thomas gave me on our 30th anniversary while soft jazz played low from the radio downstairs. For the first time in days, my hands felt steady. Not because I was calm exactly, but because uncertainty had finally disappeared. Pain becomes easier to carry once confusion ends. I knew exactly who Vanessa was now. More importantly, I finally understood who I needed to become in response to her. I wore a dark emerald dress that evening, simple and elegant, with the cream-colored cardigan Vanessa mocked at Christmas folded neatly across my arm. I chose it deliberately. Some things deserve to survive other people's cruelty. Before leaving the house, I paused beside Thomas's photograph on the mantel. "You always did hate bullies," I whispered softly. Then I picked up my coat and walked out into the cold. Daniel's house glowed brightly against the wet, snowy darkness when I arrived. Expensive outdoor lanterns lined the driveway, while music drifted faintly from inside. Several unfamiliar luxury cars already filled the street. Vanessa loved hosting events where successful people could admire one another's kitchens. I rang the bell once and waited. Vanessa opened the door almost immediately, wearing a fitted black velvet dress and diamond earrings I recognized instantly. They belonged to Thomas's mother. She smiled the second she saw me, but something sharp flickered briefly behind her expression when she noticed my cardigan. "Margaret," she said sweetly. "You came. You invited me." Her eyes narrowed almost invisibly at my calm tone. "Of course." She stepped aside gracefully. "Everyone is in the dining room." The house smelled like expensive perfume, roasted meat, and candle wax. Laughter drifted through the hallway while crystal glasses clinked softly in the background. Guests stood gathered near the fireplace discussing ski vacations, investment markets, and private schools for their children. Vanessa moved through the crowd like a politician working a fundraiser, touching arms lightly and smiling on cue whenever someone looked her way. Daniel spotted me first near the staircase. Relief crossed his face so quickly it almost made me sad. "Mom." He walked over and kissed my cheek awkwardly. "I am glad you came." "Are you?" He hesitated just long enough for the truth to show itself before answering. "Of course." I nodded politely without arguing. Across the room, Lily gave me a small, nervous smile from beside the piano. She looked exhausted already. Poor child. She had spent the entire week trapped between loyalty and honesty while the adults around her pretended nothing poisonous was happening beneath the surface of our family. Dinner began around 7:30. Vanessa seated me near the far end of the table beside two business associates I had never met before. Not beside Daniel. Not beside Lily. Placement reveals priorities inside families more honestly than words ever do. Throughout dinner, Vanessa performed kindness loudly enough for everyone to notice. She complimented my earrings twice, asked exaggerated questions about my quiet little routines at home. At one point, she even touched my shoulder gently while saying, "We all worry about you being alone so much now." Anyone watching from the outside would have thought she was devoted. But beneath every sentence sat the same quiet message. Frail, lonely, aging, temporary. Daniel drank more wine than usual that evening. I noticed because Thomas used to do the same thing whenever stress weighed too heavily on him. By dessert, Daniel's smile looked tired around the edges. Meanwhile, Vanessa seemed radiant, confident, victorious. She truly believed Christmas dinner broke me. That was her mistake. Around 9 o'clock, as snow began falling lightly outside again, Vanessa stood near the head of the table tapping her champagne glass gently with a spoon. "Before midnight," she announced warmly, "I just want to say how grateful I am for everyone here tonight." Guests smiled and lifted glasses politely. Vanessa's eyes slid toward me. "Family changes over time," she continued smoothly. "People grow. Life moves forward whether we are ready or not. But healthy families adapt together." Several guests nodded thoughtfully while Daniel stared down into his drink. Vanessa smiled wider. "Sometimes holding onto the past too tightly prevents everyone else from moving ahead." There it was again. The same performance wrapped inside prettier words. This time, however, something very different happened. I set down my wine glass carefully and looked directly at her across the table. "You are absolutely right, Vanessa." The room went strangely quiet. Surprise flashed briefly across her face before she recovered. "I am glad we agree." "So am I." I reached calmly into my purse beside my chair and removed a cream-colored envelope. Harold Bennett's business card rested neatly against the front. Vanessa's smile froze almost instantly the second she saw the name. Daniel frowned in confusion. "Mom." I placed the envelope gently onto the tablecloth between us. "Thomas left very specific instructions regarding this family," I said quietly. "And after recent events, Mr. Bennett believes it is time we all review them together." For several seconds after I placed Harold Bennett's envelope on the table, nobody moved. The only sound in the room came from the soft jazz music drifting through hidden ceiling speakers and the faint crackling of the fireplace behind the guests. Vanessa stared at the envelope like it had suddenly become dangerous. Daniel looked between the two of us in visible confusion while slowly setting down his wine glass. Around the table, conversations faded into uncomfortable silence one by one as people realized something had shifted beneath the polished surface of the evening. Vanessa recovered first. Of course she did. Women like her survive by controlling appearances. She gave a soft, nervous laugh and reached for her champagne. Margaret, this hardly seems like the time for legal discussions. Actually, I replied calmly, I believe this is exactly the right time. My voice surprised even me. Not louder, not angry, simply steady. The kind of steadiness that comes when fear finally burns itself away. Daniel frowned. Mom, what is going on? I looked at my son for a long moment before answering. In that instant, I saw both versions of him at once. The little boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder during thunderstorms, and the tired middle-aged man sitting silently while his wife slowly erased his mother from his life. Your father prepared certain protections before he died, I said quietly. Vanessa's fingers tightened visibly around her glass. Protections, she repeated carefully. I nodded once. For me, for the family, for everything he built. Vanessa forced another smile, but this time it looked strained around the edges. Well, I am sure Thomas simply wanted everyone taken care of. He did, I answered, especially in situations involving manipulation, humiliation, or attempts to isolate family members. The silence after those words felt heavy enough to crack glass. Daniel sat up straighter immediately. Across the table, Lily stared down into her lap, while one older guest quietly excused himself toward the living room, pretending not to notice the tension unfolding. Vanessa's face lost a little more color. I do not understand what you are implying. I think you understand perfectly. For the first time all evening, she stopped smiling entirely. Daniel looked back and forth between us anxiously. Mom, what exactly is this about? Slowly, I removed several folded copies of the trust documents from the envelope and placed them beside the centerpiece candles. The gold light flickered softly across Thomas's signature at the bottom of the pages. Your father established an irrevocable trust years ago, I explained. Certain family assets are protected under behavioral clauses managed through Harold Bennett's office. Daniel blinked hard. Behavioral clauses? Yes. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. Any family member found attempting to humiliate, manipulate, pressure, or remove me from my home or family position risks losing inheritance privileges connected to the estate. Vanessa went completely still. Daniel stared at me like he no longer recognized the conversation happening in front of him. That cannot be real, Vanessa said sharply. It is very real, I replied. Harold confirmed everything this week. For the first time since I had known her, true panic flickered openly across Vanessa's face before she quickly tried covering it with outrage. This is absurd. You are twisting things because you are upset about Christmas dinner. Christmas dinner. Interesting how quickly cruel people minimize their own cruelty once consequences appear. Daniel finally turned toward his wife fully. Vanessa, he said slowly. What is she talking about? Nothing, she snapped too quickly. Your mother is being dramatic. Dramatic. Another familiar word. I reached calmly for my wine glass before answering. You had property evaluations for my house and the lake cabin in your office before Christmas. Vanessa's eyes widened instantly. Across the table, Daniel's face drained of color. What? She looked toward him sharply. Daniel, do not listen to this. You discussed moving me into assisted living facilities before ever speaking to me directly. That is not true. You told Lily I was preventing the family from moving forward. Daniel turned toward his daughter immediately. Lily looked frightened but nodded slowly. The silence afterward felt devastating. Vanessa stared at Lily in complete disbelief, as if betrayal from a child offended her more than her own actions ever had. I was only trying to help this family, she whispered weakly. And there it was at last. Not remorse. Not apology. Self-pity. I suddenly realized something important while looking at her. Vanessa never truly believed older people still possessed power once they became inconvenient. She thought loneliness made people defenseless. She thought grief made people easy to remove quietly. But Thomas understood something she never did. Dignity survives even when everything else falls apart. I stood slowly from the table and reached for my coat. Nobody tried stopping me. Daniel looked shattered sitting there beneath the chandelier light, while the truth settled heavily across the room around him. Vanessa remained frozen beside him, staring at the documents like they had personally betrayed her. Before leaving, I looked at my son one final time. "Your father spent his whole life protecting this family," I said quietly. "I suggest you ask yourself why he believed I would eventually need protection from people inside it." Then I turned and walked toward the front door, while snow fell softly beyond the windows. Behind me, nobody spoke. For once, silence belonged to them instead of me.